Buenos días, mi nombre es Roberto Vargas, soy presidente de la Asociación FinTech del Perú y me complace mucho darles la bienvenida a este webinar de cómo implementar Open Banking en el Perú, que gracias al trabajo conjunto con dos de nuestros embajadores, Luis Barragán y Álvaro Castro Lora, hemos podido concretar con el apoyo de FData. Y me gustaría darles una intro rápida sobre en qué estamos en Open Banking y cómo Perú está jugando en este sector emergente dentro del desarrollo del sistema financiero. Hace pocas semanas participamos en un evento global cuya sede virtual fue enfocada en Brasil y tuvimos un espacio donde compartimos algunas de las buenas prácticas, tanto en el sector privado desde el punto de vista regulatorio, sobre qué es el Open Banking y cuál es el estado del arte de Perú. Hoy día lo que vamos a hacer es conocer más sobre la metodología que se aplica para implementar Open Banking o desplegar Open Banking. Y hay dos grandes cosas que tienen que ver con asuntos públicos: los datos de las personas y, por supuesto, la gobernanza del Open Banking, que muchas veces tiene modelos muy diferentes, como en Brasil, Estados Unidos, UK y Asia. Entonces ahora vamos a aprender de Gavin Littlejohn. Él es el director de una asociación, un gremio global de firmas que están en el mundo del Open Finance y, por supuesto, Open Banking, cuya sede está en Reino Unido. Gavin Littlejohn tiene una extensa experiencia en temas de Open Banking y, por supuesto, ha actuado como consultor para diferentes stakeholders a nivel global. FData actualmente tiene operaciones o intervenciones en Sudamérica, Norteamérica, en Euroasia y en algunas partes de Europa también. Entonces, luego vamos a conocer, gracias a nuestros invitados peruanos, con Lucho Barragán, el tema del ecosistema fintech en Perú y cómo estamos en Open Banking.
No fue que...
Y finalmente nos va a acompañar Álvaro Castro Lora para darnos una mirada y un refresco sobre cuál es el tema regulatorio, en qué estamos y cuáles son los desafíos y a dónde vamos. Entonces, por favor, estamos listos para escuchar a Gavin Littlejohn, que es el director de FData Global. Adelante, por favor.
Hello, my name is Gavin Littlejohn. I'm the chair of the Financial Data and Technology Association. Today, together with my colleagues Richard Pryor, who's the chief executive, and Bruno Diniz, who's the region director for FData in South America, we will be talking to you about the development of an open banking and open finance regime and what that might mean for the Peruvian economy. We look forward to taking questions at the end of this discussion. In the meantime, I will take you through an introduction of FData and its background and run through a few slides just explaining a few of the key concepts and the importance of their impact on the broader ecosystem. But first, let me take you to the organization itself that we work for. So you can see on the map in front of you that the association operates in several different domains. We're organized on a continental structure. We were set up in Europe in 2013 during the period when data access was added into the second Payment Services Directive in the European Union. So PSD2 came into force in 2018, but the core concepts of the directive were drafted and the ink was dry in 2013. So that was when we were founded at the request of the UK Treasury to give the banking sector and the regulators a party representing the third-party providers, the fintechs, if you like, giving those actors a party to work with and negotiate with on the key terms. We've developed since then. In 2017, we launched in North America, supporting a growing ecosystem of data aggregators and customer-facing fintechs. And from that, we've extended out into, in quick order, into Australasia, Asia, and into South America, where we're currently working from today. You can see in the next slide deck a little bit about our membership. So the growth you can see, or the number of parties in Europe and North America reflects the fact that we've been in those markets that bit longer. But we're seeing very rapid growth now in Australasia and in South America of significant actors. Particularly, you can see in the South American chapter one interesting element, which is that 3 trade associations, AB Fintechs, ABCD, and APIPAG, are actually trade associations in the Brazilian ecosystem who've joined the FData community to get access to very specific open banking and open finance expertise. One of the things that we do in our role is that we take information on what has worked and what hasn't worked and the issues that have been evolving from one market, and we share it with other markets. And in that way, those learnings help to help the local ecosystem to develop more efficiently, and for the authorities and decision makers to think through what the key aspects are of the ecosystem characteristics that they like best. What we're going to try to do is to distill today some of those key learnings down into what we're describing in the next slide as essential elements for a healthy and successful open banking, open finance ecosystem. So the first one, and really central to the whole concept, is the customer data right. So if we were to think about what open finance is, fundamentally it's the right of the end customer, be they a consumer or a business, as the data subject, to be able to safely share information that pertains to them with another actor. And we've used the thought here of having an authorized actor, authorized provider, because it's not a free-for-all. It shouldn't be the case that the end customer isn't certain whether the actor that they're sharing the data to is a legitimate entity that's going to be properly supervised and acting in their interest, right through to it being, at the opposite extreme, a criminal gang that's trying to get their information and using that information for doing the customer harm. So it's really important that we set out this concept of data being shared to a regulated or accredited actor as a key concept, and that the customer should always have the right to do that, and that the data provider, I guess we're going to call it here to keep it consistent, the data donor provides that data to the data recipient, where they're not in a position where they can say no. And that effectively gives the data recipient, as an authorized party, the right to deal on a fair and equitable basis, where the data donor, for example, a large bank or investment business, can't choose to favor one data recipient over another, for example, because they've got some commercial deal with that party. And what that leads us to is this thought that if there is that customer data right, it creates full reciprocity. It's not just that the big company has to share the data with the small company, but given the customer's permission, the small company should have to share the data with the big company. And that requires, in order for that customer data right to be fulfilled, that all participants in the ecosystem should be required to participate. You should not just be allowed to say, actually, we don't want to play in this market space, and therefore we're not enabling any party to get data the customer has shared with us. And I guess the other important factor is that the data that is shared represents facts about the end customer. It's not that a data donor should be required to share their intellectual property. An easy way to understand the difference between those two would be, for example, the difference between a credit score and a credit file. The credit file containing facts about the individual or the business, the credit score being a method that that company has applied, which is their intellectual property. So we're not in any way suggesting that the data donor should be required to share information that they've derived from the factual data to create something else. That's not the case. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is consent. So if the customer has established that they have the right to share the data, they express that free will through explicit consent. And the customer should be able to remove that consent when they no longer wish to have the service that's supplied by the data recipient company. It's really important when consent is shared that it contains information that gives legitimacy to the process. So the data recipient organization should make it clear what business they're in. And for example, if they're in the business of helping the company, the customer, be that a business or a consumer, to find a new loan for some purpose, then they should do just that. They shouldn't, for example, take the data to enable the customer to search for a loan and then use the data for an entirely different purpose. For example, selling the data to an advertising company without the customer's permission. And they should make it very clear precisely what data is needed for the role. So for example, the data recipient shouldn't be receiving data that's irrelevant to the job. They shouldn't be trying to take fields of data just in case they might need it at a future date, and should apply reasonably the concept of fair processing and data minimization, which basically means that you only take the data that you need for the job and not just anything that you fancy asking for. Okay, so one other thing which I'd like to say about consent. When the consent is revoked, it may be revoked at either the data donor or the data recipient side. It would be very important to the health of the ecosystem were the data to be revoked at the data donor side, the consent to be revoked at the data donor side, that they have a method of notifying through the API to the data recipient that the connection has been terminated in real time. And the reason for that is the end customer may have a financial product or service that is tethered to that consent and may not understand that by terminating the consent at the data donor side that they may be leading themselves into potential harm. An example could be if they've got a line of credit attached to the enablement of the data recipient to monitor their accounts and serve the credit. It could be that if they terminate the consent that they've no longer got that line of credit. So it's important that not that the end customer is blocked at any point from terminating consent to their data. Of course, they're enabled to do that, but the parties on both sides are notified that termination has taken place so that they can talk to the customer in a reasonable way. So I'm going to move on now to point 3, which is the liability framework. I think from my perspective and watching what has unfolded across different markets, this is the one that's challenging to get right. And there are some interesting frameworks in the market today. Not all of them have got all of the aspects right, although some of them have made headway in certain areas. So let's just go through what the key areas are here. The first is that you need to seek to mitigate the impact on the end customer of loss of some description or misuse of data, which may lead to loss. And let's think through what those might be. So firstly, in an open banking or open finance ecosystem, we have moved from a linear relationship between the customer and their supplier of services to a plural or multilateral ecosystem where the end customer may have shared the same data from the same source to one or multiple parties. And therefore, there are various different actors that have custodianship of the same data. Firstly, the data donor. Secondly, the customer themselves will have a copy of the data, potentially. And thirdly, the customer may have shared that data to different parties for a range of different service provisions. So we need to make sure that if one of those parties in the ecosystem, either the data donor or the data recipient, or indeed, and this is quite an interesting part, the customer themselves haven't misused the data in a certain way, because we're going to also lay out, in this case, the prerequisites of having an adequate policy in place to enable that the customer is made whole when things go wrong. So under PSD2 in the European Union, they required the data donor to enable the sharing of payments data. And they said that when the data is shared, that the party who is the recipient, if they're not a large actor with a big balance sheet, for example, a retail bank, that they would have to put in place cyber insurance to enable the customer to be made whole in the event of a major data breach, or where the customer's information was spilled on the internet, and so forth. Thankfully, to date, under PSD2 in the EU, we've not yet had a public incident that has been of any scale, but I don't think it's reasonable to assume that there won't be something happen. Of course, there will at some stage, and it requiring the market participants to be adequately covered to provide some compensation to the victim is a useful thing to anticipate. And then, how do you make the customer whole? How do you work your way through the issues relating to that to enable such concepts as accountability, to ensure that the liability is clear and that you know which party is at fault? It could be, for example, that the data recipient who was in breach and had misused the data or had it stolen might not know that they'd had the information stolen, or may not choose to put their hand up and say, it was us that led to the issue. So we need to make sure that these ecosystems are well organized, that everybody's trained what to do, that the regulatory authorities have the rights of audit, forensic audit on the systems to try to understand where the breach, if there was a breach, took place. And this ecosystem needs to work well for both the sharing of data across the open banking, open finance strata, and also for payment initiation. So clearly, again, in Europe under PSD2, it's not just that the data can be shared, but that a third party, in this case, we're calling them data recipients, can also be in a position to initiate payments through the rails of the banking system. And we need to work through an ecosystem here where the end customer can get satisfaction without having to go to court. So having an elegant and low friction dispute resolution system would be very helpful for the customer, so that anything that does happen, it doesn't require a huge amount of work for the customer to get some satisfaction. And one of the big issues in the EU, of course, we have the very well known General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, and that covers all instances of data sharing when it's personal data pertaining to consumers. But GDPR does not cover business users, whereas PSD2 covers business users but is restricted just to payments data. So the point I'm making is that when you're designing the open finance ecosystem, try to make sure that the financial services regulations and the data privacy regulations work together, and that there are no obvious gaps like the ones I've identified in the European Union, where there are things that are clearly out with the scope of open finance at the moment, and where the regulatory authorities are aware that there are applications which are, for example, dealing in both regulated data and in unregulated data. So I'm going to move on to the fourth slide now, which is the legal and regulatory system. And the most important thing here is that that system properly implements the first 3 points that I made, which is that there is a customer data right, and that's enabled by the customer via explicit consent, and that there's a clear understanding of what happens when things go wrong and how the customer is catered for. So the legal and regulatory system has to make those things work together elegantly. And the general point here is that having actors in the ecosystem regulated enables some supervision and coordination in a way that would not be possible if they were not part of the supervisory framework. The second is the law should not technology. In PSD2, they got that part right. In fact, they didn't require any particular technology to be used. They were technology agnostic. And the reason for that and why that's a good idea is technology moves much faster than law. And you could end up in a situation where you can't change the rules quick enough in law, but where the technology is already quickly overtaking it, or where, for example, new issues relating to security, for example, would make a particular technical method outdated, and you can't simply rely on having that baked in. But the law should absolutely compel the participants to work together on prescriptive technical standards. It would be wholly remiss for me to think, or to try to explain to Peru that things worked well in the EU in delivery of technology. They did not. They worked very, very poorly. So the reason for that is when the Payment Services Directive was written, it assumed an older technology called screen scraping, where the passwords relating to the end customer were shared by the end customer to the data recipient, who then did all of the engineering job and built a model to harvest the data using the customer's password. As we move to API technology, we now have the data donor being in a position where they are required to build something. And it's really important that when both parties are required to build something, both the data donor and the data recipient, that there's some coordination of that capability. And the most important element here is that the law should require those parties to work together on developing the standards and developing the implementation. And actually, we've not found any real argument amongst the people who are smart technologists on the methods there have been some questions on scope, but not the methods. The best practice technology easily wins out. So moving on to the next slide, the technical standards here, very straightforward. Once you understand the legal and governance framework within which this will sit, deciding the high-level standards, in the modern world, that would include APIs. It would include digital identity so that you can make sure that you're able to identify the end party, that it would be using a consistent security profile such that the data donors and data recipients can easily, from an engineering perspective, connect to each other in a secure way, and that there should be some trust framework established between these regulated actors so that they know that there isn't a bad actor who's not a regulated actor but is pretending to be, is able to insert themselves into the ecosystem. So some three-way methodology that has the data donor, data recipient, and between them a trust framework that is able to check on the regulated status as held at the central bank or national regulator, and to provide some assurance to the parties that they are who they say they are, would be kind of core to this. And then thinking about governance and funding, delivering all of this, lots of markets have tried it where the data donors do what they want and the data recipients do what they want, and there's nobody really representing the voice of the customer and no supervision or coordination from the regulatory authorities. So in effect, it's up to each actor to do as they may. That doesn't really work. And we've seen numerous examples where the qualities in the delivery, particularly because there's not necessarily an alignment of interest, not every data donor is aligned to the needs of every data recipient or the needs of the end customer at the same time and for the same value exchange. So putting in place a central orchestration body is a requirement. Those parties should be all represented in the governance with a strong voice for each. The companies in it, so both the data donors and the recipients, should pay, not the end customer representatives or the regulators, of course, but those who've got a commercial interest should pay into a central orchestration body on a fair and proportionate basis. What that basically means is large companies who are getting more out of it from a value exchange perspective should proportionally pay more, medium companies less, and startups that have got no customers shouldn't pay anything. And that enables the ecosystem to mature and for companies to not have a barrier in place that stops innovative new companies from starting and getting involved in the ecosystem. In terms of priorities, consultation between those actors is critical. It shouldn't be law that sets the whole scope of priorities and the roadmap for delivery, but the law should prescribe that participation is required and then leave it to the industry to work together through that central orchestration body in an annual consultation to work out which things to prioritize. And then you do that via a phased implementation. Trying to do all of the open finance ecosystem at one time would be difficult and not to be advised. But the key thing here is that when decisions are reached, that they're absolutely binding, and parties can't say, well, we didn't vote for that idea and therefore we're not doing it. They should be involved, all parties should be involved in the consultation, they should put forward their point of view, but when decisions are made, there needs to be binding and accountable delivery. And then I guess the final kind of key point here is once delivery is made, there needs to be proper conformance testing. There needs to be an understanding that the ecosystem participants have all met the required standards that have been set down in the written standards. And the best way to do that is is not to leave it up to the ecosystem actors themselves to decide whether or not they have met the standards. That leads just to a lot of arguing, makes it very difficult for the regulatory authorities to really understand which side of the argument to believe. And ideally, if you're able to develop a neutral central technology to measure technologies, that works best because it does not have a commercial interest in what's found or reported, but simply measures the performance. So that could be the speed of the return of the API, the throughput of the data, how many dropped calls there are in an API call, that the user experience guidelines have been adhered to, which is more subjective, but there should be some central authority that checks whether the key user experience requirements have been delivered by the party. And it really enables problem solving. In these situations, if there are issues and they're flushed out and you have a central implementation entity, and that central implementation entity has got some appreciation of the issues that are afflicting particular actors, then we can work with those actors to try to resolve them. And that's good for both the data donor and the data recipient. But of course, the end result here, and by far the most important, is that it leads to better customer outcomes. Because only if the technologies and the user experience is good will the data recipient applications work effectively and the customer experience be good. And ideally, those customer experiences should be focusing on trying to deliver innovation and competition, which will drive better customer outcomes. The other thing, of course, about this whole process is that because the data donor is subject to the same rules and reciprocity as the data recipient, it's to be encouraged, particularly among large actors, that they also think about occupying the data recipient role. It would be very important that the data recipient is able to innovate and, in the case of a large bank, for example, to know where their customers are when they're not with them. Those sorts of opportunities create much more tailored user experiences, ensure that the products that are manufactured and delivered to customers are suitable and that they treat those customers fairly, and that the online experience is enhanced because the end customer isn't having to constantly move into offline channels, for example, to establish their identity or to hand over information to a competing party. Ultimately, open finance is about solving information asymmetries in the ecosystem, enabling parties to compete on a fair basis and to build experiences that lead to better customer outcomes. So that's the end of the initial comments. And now what I'm going to do is work with my colleagues and move into the Q&A. Many thanks.
Okay, bueno, muchas gracias, Gavin. Thank you very much for your presentation. We are going to have, vamos a tener ahora 5 minutos que voy a hacerles una presentación muy breve sobre lo que es Open Banking y el ecosistema FinTech, y luego Álvaro va a hablar 5 minutos sobre lo que es la regulación financiera. So, Gavin, Richard, we're going to have 5 minutes about the FinTech ecosystem in Peru, and then we're going to have Álvaro speaking about regulations, and then we'll have at the end some questions. Okay, Álvaro, ¿me puedes habilitar, por favor, para compartir pantalla? Entonces, continuando con la presentación.
Listo, Lucho.
Ok, gracias. Voy a hacer una presentación breve de lo que es mi empresa. Yo soy Luis Barragán, soy gerente general de la empresa Open Big Data y el tema de hoy día es Open Banking. Nosotros venimos ya siguiendo todo el ecosistema FinTech hace más de 5 años, desde que empezó en el 2016 más o menos esta tendencia acá en Perú. Y ya gracias a Roberto estamos trabajando en conjunto con la asociación para poder hacer actividades para difundir nuevos conceptos, y hoy día por eso estamos con Gavin. Y nosotros como Big Data hemos armado todo un FinTech Marketplace que tiene una serie de componentes, tanto por el lado frontend como el lado backend, y lo muestro solamente como una referencia porque todos estos componentes justamente se pueden integrar, ¿no?, con una solución fintech, con un banco, y permiten justamente poder lograr esa unión que menciona Gavin en su presentación del Open Banking, de poder intercambiar lo que son diversas informaciones del historial financiero de un cliente. Y bueno, para eso quería comentarles también sobre el ecosistema FinTech acá en Perú. Este es, bueno, es el último mapa que conseguí desde el año 2019, pero sin embargo tiene casi la mayoría de las que están ahora vigentes. Hoy en día, si bien acá dice 127 en el mapa a noviembre de 2019, hoy en día el ecosistema ha crecido bastante y está alrededor de unas 170, 180 empresas. Y cada vez están llegando más emprendimientos del extranjero. Y quería resaltar de este mapa, digamos, dos casos que tenemos acá en Perú, que son iniciativas que se están dando sobre Open Banking. Tenemos, por ejemplo, Cambista. Cambista es una de las primeras fintech que empezó con el tipo de cambio de soles a dólares y ha ido evolucionando en su plataforma. Y ellos ya se han logrado integrar vía APIs con Interbank. Y hoy en día, a la hora que uno ingresa a Cambista, puede ya no solamente hacer operaciones de cambio de soles a dólares o viceversa, sino también ya puede abrir cuentas de Interbank. Entonces es un primer paso, digamos, que se está dando en el ecosistema fintech peruano, donde ya vemos una integración muy fuerte de una fintech peruana con un banco peruano, y estoy seguro que van a seguir pronto, este año seguramente, nuevas iniciativas. Y tenemos el caso de Rapibank, que bueno, Rappi es una multinacional, ya es un unicornio que nació en Colombia, pero acá en Perú, para ingresar, ellos también como estrategia decidieron aliarse con un banco, en este caso también con Interbank. Y Rappi justamente y Interbank han trabajado en conjunto todo este tema de integraciones de las APIs que mencionaba Gavin, para poder integrar la información de todo lo que ofrece Rappi junto con lo que es los servicios del banco, ¿no? Sé que Interbank ofrece la parte de la tarjeta de crédito y Rappi ofrece sus servicios de delivery y toda la super app con un montón de servicios que tiene ahí. Entonces, esa era mi participación, que quería comentarles lo que es el ecosistema FinTech y los emprendimientos, iniciativas que están habiendo de Open Banking. Acá les dejo mis datos por si necesitan algún contacto. Y a continuación los dejo con Álvaro, Álvaro Castro Lora de Sumara Hub, que es una un estudio boutique especializado en todo lo que es regulación financiera, nos va a dar una charla breve sobre lo que es la situación actual en Perú y un poco también en la región. Y Álvaro, adelante, y luego pasamos a la ronda final de preguntas para Gavin y Richard que están con nosotros. Gracias.
Perfecto, Lucho. No sé si podrías dejar de compartir para que no se maree la
Sí,
audiencia.
sí, sí. Ok. Ok, ya está.
Listo. Perfecto. Gracias por la invitación a la Asociación FinTech y por supuesto a ti, Lucho. Es un gusto, Gavin. A ver, lo primero que debemos decir en materia de Open Banking desde un punto de vista regulatorio es que es una obviedad, es que no está regulado, ¿no? No hay una normativa que fuerce, puede ser en esos términos, a los bancos o las entidades financieras a compartir data de los clientes con terceros o permitir que empresas de tecnología o fintechs o cualquier proveedor de servicios o inclusive a los bancos entre sí o las entidades financieras entre sí conectar vía API, ¿no es cierto?, vía APIs para compartir información de los clientes, ¿no? Entonces, no hay nada que los obligue y esa es una gran discusión que existe a nivel mundial, ¿no? Es decir, debe ser el Open Banking, el Open Finance, obligatorio o debe ser voluntario. Lucho ha mencionado un par de ejemplos voluntarios, de alguna manera, de apificación, que es básicamente lo que ha hecho el Interbank con Rappi y con Cambista, que son dos compañías de tecnología, servicios financieros, dos fintech, cada una obviamente en tamaños distintos, pero dos ejemplos de open banking totalmente voluntario. Entonces, ese es el nivel que tenemos hoy, los ejemplos que tenemos hoy. Hay ciertamente y lo comentaste tú, Lucho, un artículo hace buen tiempo, tenemos un embrión de open banking en el marco normativo peruano, que es el reporte consolidado crediticio, el RCC, ¿no? Que es un ejemplo de colaboración y compartición de información financiera de los clientes, ¿no? Esto está regulado por la SBS y establece que las entidades financieras comparten información de los pagos mensuales de los clientes con la SBS y esto genera una base de datos centralizada con toda la historia crediticia pues, de los préstamos en el país, que es compartida entre todos los bancos y con las centrales de riesgo, las centrales privadas de riesgo con periodicidad mensual, ¿no? No obstante, evidentemente esto es una limitación, aquí no hay apificación, porque aquí esta forma de compartir la información no es en tiempo real, no es que las entidades financieras acceden directamente a la data, sino que básicamente tiene un desfase de 30 o 60 días, porque es básicamente el tiempo que demoran las empresas del sistema financiero en reportar a la SBS para que la SBS ponga a disposición del mercado esta información. Entonces, no es un ejemplo exacto del potencial del open banking que implica inmediatez, ¿no es cierto? Tiempo real, pero es un embrión, es un ejemplo de que sí es posible la colaboración, pero es una colaboración que ha sido establecida por mandato normativo, porque donde el espíritu detrás de este mandato es cuidar la estabilidad, ¿no?, del mercado financiero. ¿Por qué? Porque, digamos, para que todas las empresas del sistema financiero sepan si sus clientes están endeudados con alguno de ellos, ¿no? Porque para evitar el sobreendeudamiento, porque el sobreendeudamiento puede generar que el cliente deje de pagarle a uno o a más de estos prestamistas del sistema financiero y se afecte, por lo tanto, si esto se volviese sistémico, se afecta al sistema financiero en su conjunto. Entonces, el driver o la motivación de este reporte consolidado crediticio es distinto, está más pensado en la protección del sistema. Cuando el Open Banking está más pensado en poner al cliente al centro del diseño, como bien mencionó Lucho y bien mencionó Gavin en su presentación. Entonces, no tenemos una norma equivalente en el Perú. En el mundo, efectivamente, eso ya está avanzando, ya existe inclusive el Comité de Supervisión Bancaria de Basilea ya ha sacado una serie de guidelines, de estándares recomendados para implementación de Open Banking. Y el caso paradigmático de desarrollo normativo es el caso europeo, ¿no? En Europa existe la PSD2, la Payment Service Directive o Directiva de Pago de Servicios, que es una directiva que aplica a todos los países miembros de la Unión Europea, ¿no? Que tiene que ver con el elemento esencial del punto de vista regulatorio del Open Banking, que es los datos personales. Es decir, de la perspectiva en la que estamos hoy día en el Perú y en muchos otros países, la protección de los datos personales tiene un enfoque negativo. Negativo en el sentido de que, básicamente, nadie puede tratar la data personal de una persona, valga la redundancia, a menos que cuente con su autorización, ¿no? Entonces es un enfoque más de protección. Con el PSD2 se llega a un enfoque más impositivo, es decir, ya no solamente que está muy bien, que nadie puede tratar tu data sin tu autorización, sino además está la base para que las entidades del sistema financiero estén obligados a compartir la data con quien autorice el cliente, típicamente proveedores de servicios financieros, porque esa data compartida va a permitir que se diseñen y se generen productos financieros a la medida de las necesidades y la conveniencia de los clientes. Entonces, es un paso más adelante en cómo está empoderado el cliente de servicios financieros respecto de su data. Entonces, esta directiva ya se ha ido desarrollando a nivel nacional, ¿no es cierto? Esta es una directiva supranacional. En España, ya desde el 2018, ya se han incorporado, hay un Real Decreto, el 19 del 2018, ya incluye una regulación que tiene que ver con Open Banking. También en Reino Unido hay ciertos avances en el tema de Open Banking. Y digamos, más en la región, tenemos el caso de México, ¿no? Que en su famosa ley FinTech, o ley para regular las instituciones de tecnología financiera, ya incluye en su artículo 76 que se deben establecer APIs que posibiliten entre las entidades del sistema financiero que permiten la conectividad y el acceso a datos sin interfaz. Es decir, ya México, que nos lleva ventaja y escala, ya tiene incorporada una referencia al Open Banking en su ley FinTech. Entonces, que además es bien interesante que sea en el marco de la ley FinTech que lo incluyan y no en una normativa de supervisión bancaria, sino es específicamente pues porque no se tiene que ser un genio para darse cuenta que el gran potencial, además de que las entidades del sistema financiero comparten data entre sí, es que la compartan con los outsiders, que en este caso son las empresas de tecnología o las FinTech. En Chile, por ejemplo, no hay regulación, pero hay ciertos desarrollos que se basan básicamente en un estándar de comunicación entre las entidades del sistema financiero, ¿no? Entonces, eso es lo que igual en los Estados Unidos no hay regulación, pero eso no ha impedido que hagan desarrollos voluntarios. Entonces, la discusión siempre va a ser si es que tiene que forzarse a las empresas financieras a compartir la data o debe permitirse que lo hagan voluntariamente. Y de eso se deriva una segunda discusión, es si el acceso vía APIs a la data de un banco o de una entidad financiera debe ser, además de voluntario, debe ser gratuito o oneroso, debe pagar algo, porque, claro, los entidades financieros pueden decir, esta data que yo he generado tiene un valor, me ha costado tiempo fidelizar al cliente, toda mi infraestructura, toda mi estrategia comercial, y no se la puedo regalar a alguien más. Esa es una discusión conceptual bien interesante. Se supone, digamos, donde se ha establecido la obligación del Open Banking, se ha considerado que la data no es de las empresas del sistema financiero, sino de los clientes, con lo cual no deberían establecerse ningún esquema restrictivo que no sea razonable para que sea compartida la información entre unas y otras entidades. Los retos, definitivamente, lo que tendría que abordar el regulador peruano o cualquier otro regulador es, primero, cuáles son los requisitos para que los bancos de los sistemas financieros o las entidades del sistema financiero compartan data, porque finalmente es data de los clientes. ¿Cuál va a ser el API o el organismo de establecimiento de estos estándares técnicos? Los temas de competencia. Hay un riesgo libre de competencia porque, digamos, compartiendo la información, podría haber la tentación o una exposición al riesgo a que haya cartelización, a que haya coordinación de los términos de los productos financieros. Hay también involucramiento de la Autoridad de Protección del Consumidor, porque tiene que garantizarse que este flujo libre de información no perjudique a los consumidores desde un punto de vista de prácticas monopólicas, la protección de los datos personales sin ninguna duda, y por último, el mecanismo de solución de controversias o de disputas cuando hay alguna discrepancia respecto al uso de la información entre las empresas o con respecto a los clientes. Así que esa es la foto, esa es la agenda. Como ha dicho Lucho, ya hay empresas que están comenzando a testear el tema de Open Banking sin regulación, pero ciertamente acá la discusión va a ser si es que el ritmo que se marca esos desarrollos de Open Finance voluntarios es suficiente para realmente impulsar los beneficios que trae el Open Banking, como es el desarrollo de mercado, la inclusión financiera y el diseño de servicios y productos a la medida de los clientes. Eso es, Lucho.
Ok. Hola, Roberto, no sé si hay algunas consultas. Veo que hay unas preguntas en el chat.
Sí, hay algunas preguntas. First, for Gavin, thank you very much for the presentation. We appreciate your collaboration and cooperation with the FinTech Association of Peru and the establishment of a new concept of open banking in our country. Thank you very much. The first question is related to the difference between open banking and open finance. Please tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so if you were to think about the customer data right and the right of a end customer, be they a consumer or business, to choose to share information that's held about them from one party to another, that's often referred to as open life or open data. And open finance is, in a Venn diagram, a subset of that. So within the greater data universe, we have all the financial verticals: insurance, investment, pension, savings, loans, mortgages, and transactional payment accounts. So the domain of open finance is choosing to share your data that the customer has with a data incumbent, with an incumbent supplier, to another regulated party. And open banking is simply a subset of that, which is just the banking products. At the moment in Europe, under PSD2, we've got a subset of open banking, which is just payments. We don't have loans, mortgages, cash savings, for example. So yeah, what we're seeing across many markets is the phased rollout of a graduated improvement in scope, moving from transactional banking and then beginning to add more product verticals into it until they reach open finance. In Australia, in India, to a certain extent, moves underway in the UK and in other markets. They're already starting to look at moving beyond the scope of financial services into utilities, telephony, health data, and other things that go even beyond financial services.
Okay, thank you, Gavin. I have a second question from my side. In the design of the framework of open banking, in the governance, is a good idea to include FinTech as a key player?
Yes. Without the data recipients, the data donors, the regulators, and the customer representatives present, you'll get a substandard outcome, because at that point it becomes dominant by one actor doing the things that favor just their own needs. Yeah, it stands to reason if two parties are building a technology together, that both parties are involved in shaping the technology. And given the fact that it's actually the end customer, the consumer or small business that's using this service, it would be beneficial to have their representatives also included, so that things like user experience, better customer outcomes, clear liability frameworks, policies that help make the customer whole when things go wrong, all of those things are taken into account. Having broad stakeholder governance is important, and fintech certainly need to be included.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question from Jose Arango. You know that we have different type of challenges in terms of facing migration. Does open banking will accelerate financial inclusion for this important population?
No. The starting point for any open finance ecosystem to take hold is digital identity. Without digital identity, you cannot distribute regulated financial products over digital channels. And so digital ID is a key building block, on top of which then a customer can sign up for services and be able to identify that they are who they say they are. And that enables simple financial services, basic bank accounts to be provisioned to customers, after which they've got more than one basic bank account, for example, a credit card and a bank account from two different providers. Then open banking makes a difference. Open banking doesn't make the same level of difference if the customer's either got, well, if they've only got one product, then it doesn't add a huge amount of value. And if they've got no financial products that are digitally enabled, then it doesn't function at all. So open banking provides, or open finance provides, massively improved financial inclusion and financial betterment, but predominantly for people who are already in the financial ecosystem in some way. It doesn't do anything at all for people who are, for example, migrants who have trouble establishing their identity, or people from underprivileged backgrounds who sometimes aren't able to produce the required documentation. And all those things need to be addressed in all markets. There's very few markets to date have done a really good job with that. The one market that I would point everybody to as an interesting case study is India, who've obviously developed a really interesting payments economy through the unified payment interface. But we mustn't forget that before they had that, they had the Aadhaar, the universal digital identity, biometric identity that's given to all Indians. And that enables them to interact with digital financial services.
Great. So digital identity is a huge challenge in terms of emerging countries, as you mentioned. We have also how to say, a training task with different stakeholders to learn more about open banking, obviously. So I have
Sorry, just coming back on that. I mean, getting a good digital identity is a foundation block for a fairer, more inclusive society. It makes it easier for innovators to get their products to market, and also is a really beneficial effect on tackling different forms of economic crime, money laundering, improved compliance. So it is hard to do, but once it's done, it is a gift that keeps giving. Digital identity is very important.
Yeah, definitely. We have 3 final questions. One more for you, Gavin, and I will leave the floor later to Alvaro. There are other 2 questions for Alvaro. Final question for you, Gavin. Please tell us some advice about what are the steps for fintech, the fintech sector, to implement open banking.
Well, typically to be involved in the ecosystem in, let's take a use case in Europe. So you're not allowed to be involved in open banking under PSD2 unless you're a regulated actor. So the first step would be to apply or to prepare to apply to become a regulated actor for this permission. And that would typically involve having proper policies in place, fit and proper people, being able to show who the directors of the organization were and that they were competent, having adequate security, having one critical requirement in the open banking system in the EU is a requirement for the fintechs to have a cyber insurance policy that covers the customer in the event of the data being misused or hacked. So those are some of the things that would be there. And then, of course, there's the whole range of other business things that fintechs need to do, depending on their situation, their stage in development, but they'll need to raise appropriate capital, potentially including the regulatory capital, depending again on the permission set they're looking for. They'll need to hire good people, have a really clear strategy for their business, and they'll need to execute very well, including on the technology. So those things are consistent across a whole range of businesses, but particularly acute in new startup regulated businesses.
Thank you very much, Gavin. The floor is yours, Álvaro. You have 2 questions.
Gracias, Roberto. Hay una pregunta y aquí también voy a tratar de traducirla también para que no dejar a Gavin fuera. Hi, Gavin. I will translate just to let you know what we're talking about. Esta pregunta de Fernando Guapaya es, ¿hay alguna proyección de cuándo podrían iniciarse las propuestas de regulación en Open Banking en Perú? ¿Y qué impacto podría tener una organización bancaria que esté iniciando la construcción de APIs para poder exponer la información de sus clientes, teniendo en cuenta que no hay regulaciones de Open Banking? La pregunta es, the question is, actually it's for me, but it's like, when it's foreseen to have a regulation on Open Banking, and how a future regulation could impact in current develops in Open Banking of financial institutions. No hay es difícil decir cuándo hay una proyección. Lo que sí puedo decir es que actualmente hay un proyecto de sandbox regulatorio. ¿No? Este proyecto de sandbox, este proyecto que prepublicó la SBC hace algunos meses, el sandbox, para los que no lo sepan, es un marco, es una especie de, es un programa en el cual permite a las empresas testear sus modelos de negocios bajo la, entre comillas, supervisión del regulador, de la SBS en este caso. ¿Y eso por qué? Básicamente para permitir testear ciertos modelos de negocio, tanto si es que no hay regulación sobre ese modelo de negocio, ese producto, ese servicio, como si es que existe normativa, pero que es restrictiva y se quiere que se flexibilice, ¿no? Ese sandbox debería ser, ¿y por qué le dicen sandbox? Porque la traducción literal es la caja de arena, donde en otros países, en el Perú, eso no es típico, pero en otros países los niños pequeños que están aprendiendo a caminar juegan en estas cajas de arena porque si se caen no se hacen daño porque está llena de arena. Bajo la misma lógica es, oye, si es que estas empresas que van a testear su modelo de negocio fallan o causan un daño, es un marco acotado de actuación con pocos clientes, ¿no? Entonces la idea es que eso no afecte al sistema, al mercado o a los clientes. Entonces, nosotros creemos, ese proyecto se espera que salga en los próximos meses. La verdad es que lo sacó el proyecto, el regulador, al fines, digamos, en junio, me parece, en mayo, junio. Nuestra preocupación era que con el cambio de gobierno se cambie la cabeza de la SBS y este proyecto quedara encarpetado, pero todo hace indicar que va a continuar la jefa de la superintendente, y entonces yo esperaría que en los próximos meses salga el sandbox. Y si sale el sandbox, creo que uno de los temas que naturalmente deberían testearse en primer lugar es el tema del Open Banking, ¿no? Ahora, eso va a ser un modelo en este momento flexible, no necesariamente un Open Banking obligatorio, ¿no? ¿Qué impacto podría haber en una empresa que ya está testeando Open Banking? Pues ahí estaríamos en un escenario de Open Banking forzoso, ¿no? Lo más probable es que ahí, por ejemplo, cuál será el estándar que se va a aplicar a nivel de los APIs y si es que esa compartición de información va a ser gratuita o con costo o con cobro, va a ser la gran discusión, ¿no? Ese creo que va a ser la discusión, pero hoy día no hay nada concreto. Y solamente brevemente para Gavin, currently we have a draft of regulatory sandbox that have been published by the banking regulator, and we foresee that one of the first tools that will be tested through this sandbox when the regulation is finally passed will be the open banking, because banks do not have a regulatory framework to test this kind of to test this API, this connection with other financial institution or fintech companies. So we expect that regulation to be approved and that one of the first models to be tested, it will be the open banking. Esa es una pregunta. Y la siguiente pregunta de Dante Guamán. Con la regulación actual de Perú, usando el Open Banking, ¿se podría crear un New Bank peruano? ¿Y qué se podría ir haciendo mientras que crean regulación? Gavin, the question here is, if with the current regulation in Peru, if we have Open Banking, there will be set some kind of the Peruvian New Bank, this fintech, which is a unicorn, the Brazilian unicorn, and what could we do with the current status of regulation? A ver, respecto a lo que permitiría el Open Banking es que las empresas, tanto el sistema financiero como las ajenas al sistema financiero, las fintech típicamente, o empresas de tecnología, puedan desarrollar productos financieros a la medida de los clientes, basándose en la data de los clientes. Y les voy a dar un breve ejemplo para digamos, aterrizarlo en forma muy sencilla. Cuando tú abres la cuenta en un banco, ¿no es cierto? Salvo que seas una persona pues, que muestres unos ingresos muy interesantes, normalmente primero abres una cuenta bancaria. Después de unos meses de estar ahorrando, por ahí te permite sacar una tarjeta de crédito. Después de estar o algún tiempo con tu tarjeta de crédito, puedes pedir un crédito de consumo y después de algún tiempo de estar esta interacción con tarjeta de crédito y crédito de consumo, puedes pedir un hipotecario, ¿no? Y luego si creas una compañía, pues el proceso es similar. Eso se llama el récord crediticio. Y el récord crediticio es lo que le permite el récord crediticio y los hábitos de consumo, en el caso de la tarjeta de crédito, es lo que le permite a las entidades financieras saber qué te pueden ofrecer y cuál es tu perfil como cliente del sistema financiero. Esa data es sumamente valiosa. Por eso es cuando tú eres cuenta en otro banco, tienes que comenzar de cero tu récord crediticio. Digamos, porque la información que se comparte a nivel central, de la central de riesgo de la SBS, es información más bien macro, ¿no? De qué créditos tienes, tu nivel de endeudamiento, pero las condiciones, las tasas, cuánto usas tu tarjeta al mes, eso no se comparte con las centrales de riesgo o a través de la SBS. Entonces, esa es data que atesora acá en tu sistema financiero. Entonces dices, oye, claro, porque yo esta información la he formado yo, ¿por qué se la voy a dar a otro? Pero al mismo tiempo, el que no se comparte esa información impide que otra entidad financiera me ofrezca un servicio financiero conociendo mi comportamiento como cliente financiero, ¿no? Entonces, el Open Banking lo que hace es, oye, esa data, hasta la medida que sea autorizada por el propio cliente, debe fluir. De manera que todos tenemos, todo el sistema de sistema financiero y las fintech, por dar un ejemplo, tenemos acceso a esa data y ya sabemos qué te podemos ofrecer y podemos competir, ¿no? Entonces, hay un elemento, la data o el no compartir la data es sin duda una barrera de acceso, ¿no? Es una defensa que tiene la entidad que, por eso eres su cliente, por eso no me robes a mi cliente, es una sensación muy habitual en estos casos, porque es tu cliente porque tú tienes la data de este cliente. Para cualquier otro tendría que ser una estimación medio en el aire, sabiendo quién te ha prestado y cuánto, para ver qué te pueden ofrecer, pero no es lo mismo, no tienen acceso a la misma data. Entonces, si es que se hubiera Open Banking, digamos, generalizado y forzoso, efectivamente, habrían muchas empresas, bancos y no bancos, que podrían brindar datos. ¿Sobre eso se podría montar un newbank? Sí, no creo que es el único factor, porque en Brasil no es que haya open banking forzoso, o sea que esa no es la explicación de que haya un newbank, pero sin duda la información es vital en un negocio financiero, con lo cual la información de los clientes sí podría impulsar el desarrollo del ecosistema fintech en general o financiero en general, ¿no? Gavin, a little summary is like that as you said, no, data is essential to develop financial services. So if there is open banking fully spread, widespread in the financial market, that will boost the development of digital banks, big fintech, big tech, providing in an open competitive scheme services for the client, for customers. So I think that the open banking definitely will promote the development of the financial system, not only among banks, but also among fintech. I think it's a good idea to have it.
For sure.
Y estas son las últimas dos preguntas. No sé si alguien más, Lucho, si tú quieres tomar el lead, o hay alguien más que quiera formular una pregunta para nosotros o para Gavin.
Parece que no. Bueno, entonces este es el segundo evento que hemos realizado donde Perú se está aproximando a conocer más y desarrollar una capacidad mínima a través del conocimiento en Open Banking. Hace poco participamos, como mencionaba al inicio, en el Open Banking Week Global 2021. Y ahí estoy poniendo el link para que conozcan sobre la participación de Perú, tanto del sector privado con la visión del desafío regulatorio para provocar un nuevo entendimiento, una nueva forma de pensar en los reguladores y otros stakeholders. Por supuesto, la asociación agradece a nuestros embajadores, a FData, a Gavin, veo donde está Bruno Diniz también y Richard Prior. A todos ellos nuestro agradecimiento por la consideración y de apoyar al nacimiento de este sector emergente global. Y ya es hora, creo, como país que podamos tender, promover y ampliar la competencia de diferentes maneras en el sector financiero para elevar el bienestar de familias e incrementar la productividad de las empresas en el país. Entonces me toca dar las palabras de cierre, salvo que alguien más tenga algún comentario, Lucho o Álvaro. Entonces, si es así, les agradezco mucho por su participación. Estaremos enviando oportunamente el PPT con el PDF con la presentación de Gavin. Y si tienen alguna pregunta, nos pueden comunicar por las redes sociales, tanto a Sumara, a Lucho Barragán con Big Data Consulting o a través nuestra de la Asociación FinTech. Muchas gracias, que tengan un buen día.
Gracias a todos.
Muchas gracias a todos. Hasta luego.
Thank you.